Maria had always dreamt of having a normal family, one where she could feel safe and loved. After her mother remarried Victor, a man who seemed to offer all the qualities of a supportive and caring father, Maria hoped that her wish might finally come true. Moving into their new home, she was filled with a cautious optimism. Victor was everything her mother needed, gentle, attentive, and apparently willing to make their new family work. Maria yearned for a father figure, someone to replace the absence of her biological father, who had left them years ago. Yet, even as they settled in, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Victor, though charming, seemed to want a little too much control over every aspect of their lives. Her mother, though seemingly strong, appeared fragile, almost as if she leaned on Victor for more than just support. Her decisions, once made independently, now seemed to be shaped by him. It wasn't that her mother was a bad person, but Maria began to sense her growing dependency on Victor, which made her feel more like an outsider in her own home. Maria's longing for a stable, loving family life quickly began to unravel. She had been left emotionally adrift by the absence of her father, and now, with Victor's increasing influence, she began to feel as though her new family was being built on shaky ground. There was an unspoken tension between her desire for family and her growing discomfort with Victor's presence. The seeds of conflict were being sown, subtle, at first, but destined to grow as the days went by. In the beginning, Victor's charm and kindness masked the darker aspects of his personality. He made Maria feel special, always complimenting her, buying her little gifts, and acting as if he genuinely wanted to be her father. At first, Maria saw Victor as the protector her mother had always needed. He was always there to listen, to console, and to offer guidance. But gradually, his acts of kindness turned into something more insidious. Victor began subtly isolating Maria from the things she loved, her friends, her hobbies, and her independence. When Maria tried to meet up with her old friends from school, Victor would casually suggest that they spend time together as a family instead. At first, it felt normal. After all, he was just trying to help her bond with him, wasn't he? But soon, it became clear that Victor's actions weren't about family togetherness. It was about control. He would discourage her from going out, making Maria feel guilty for wanting space outside of their home. Slowly, her world began to shrink. Victor would even check her phone messages or suggest that she avoid people who didn't understand the family dynamic. Maria was beginning to feel trapped in a web of Victor's making, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong. His protective gestures started to take on a darker tone. He would hover too closely when she was doing something, offering help that she never asked for. If she pushed him away, he would respond with disappointment, claiming that she didn't appreciate everything he was doing for her. Slowly, Maria began to see a pattern in Victor's behavior. What had once seemed like kindness began to feel stifling, like a cage that closed in around her. The first instance of abuse took place one evening, when Maria had gotten home late from school after a meeting. She had been working on a project for school, and when she came home, she was tired and irritated. Victor, in his usual fashion, had been waiting for her in the living room, eager to ask her questions about where she'd been and who she'd been with. At first, it seemed like a normal conversation. But the tone quickly shifted as Victor became more insistent, asking increasingly intrusive questions about her day. Maria, feeling overwhelmed and frustrated, tried to brush him off. Victor, however, didn't take kindly to her dismissal. His face tightened with irritation, and he began to lecture her about respecting authority. As he raised his voice, Maria grew more anxious. She had never seen him angry like this before. He grabbed her arm, not violently, but with enough force to make her wince. His grip tightened as he demanded that she explain herself. Suddenly, everything seemed to shift. What had started as a tense conversation spiraled into something darker. Victor's anger seemed disproportionate to the situation, and his hands roamed in ways that made Maria uncomfortable. His touch wasn't fatherly anymore, it felt invasive and controlling. Maria tried to pull away, her heart racing. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body froze. She couldn't understand what was happening. She had never been taught to recognize these signs of abuse, and her shock paralyzed her. Victor backed off only when Maria, tears brimming in her eyes, managed to push him away. He tried to calm her down, apologizing profusely, telling her it was just a misunderstanding, that he only cared about her well-being. But Maria knew something had changed. This wasn't the kind man who had welcomed her into his life, it was someone else entirely. She felt confused and ashamed, unsure of what had just occurred, but also frightened of what might happen next. The next day, when Maria finally mustered the courage to confide in her mother, she was met with disbelief. She had never felt so isolated. Her mother, though seemingly sympathetic, could not bring herself to believe Maria's words. She brushed the incident off as a misunderstanding, telling Maria that Victor only had her best interest at heart. "He's just trying to be a good father to you, Maria," her mother had said softly, almost pleadingly, as if Maria were the one who had overreacted. Maria felt like she was being forced to accept that this was her fault. Her mother's response, though gentle, stung. Victor, after all, had been so kind to her mother, so attentive. How could he be capable of hurting Maria? Her mother's denial hurt almost more than the incident itself. Maria tried to explain that Victor's behavior had been inappropriate, but her mother simply couldn't see it. She assured Maria that things would get better, that Victor just needed time to adjust, and that Maria should be patient. She even suggested that Maria might be misunderstanding his intentions, that perhaps Victor's way of showing concern was just his way of helping her grow up. Victor, sensing an opportunity, subtly turned her mother against her. He played the role of the loving, concerned stepfather to perfection, presenting himself as the one who was there to guide Maria, to protect her from harm. Maria's mother, overwhelmed and emotionally dependent on Victor, fell for his manipulation, unable to see the truth. She believed his twisted version of events and placed all the blame on Maria, making her feel even more alone. Maria, already shaken by the abuse, now had to contend with her mother's refusal to support her, compounding her feelings of helplessness. As if things weren't complicated enough, Maria's past trauma began to resurface. Her biological father had been abusive as well, though in a different way. When he had been in their lives, Maria had never felt safe. He was distant, often angry, and never affectionate. When he left, he took with him a part of Maria's sense of security and trust. Now, with Victor's actions mirroring those of her father, Maria found herself trapped in a cycle of fear and confusion. It was hard for her to distinguish between the two men, both had hurt her, both had controlled her, and both had made her feel small. Victor's behavior only served to remind Maria of the trauma she had endured with her biological father. Every touch, every look, felt like an echo of the past. This wasn't just a new family dynamic, it was a continuation of her greatest fears coming to life once again. Maria's emotional scars from her father's abuse had never fully healed, and Victor's actions reopened old wounds that she had tried to bury. Each day felt like a constant reminder of how she had never been able to escape the cycle of abuse. The abuse became more frequent, and Maria felt herself becoming more withdrawn and anxious. Victor's presence in her life grew more invasive. He controlled what she wore, who she talked to, and how she spent her time. He had his own set of rules for her to follow, all under the guise of teaching her discipline and respect. Maria's sense of self began to erode, and she no longer felt like she had any control over her own life. Her mother, who had once been her source of comfort, now only pressured Maria to be grateful for the family they had. Victor, after all, provided for them. He gave them everything they needed, and Maria was expected to appreciate it, even if it meant sacrificing her own well-being. The more Maria pushed back, the more her mother seemed to side with Victor. The emotional manipulation she had endured from her biological father now seemed to repeat itself, but this time, Maria was trapped in a different kind of nightmare, one where her own mother was complicit in her pain. Maria's isolation grew as the abuse continued, and with each passing day, she became more desperate to escape, to find some way out of the suffocating grip Victor had on her life. But without anyone to turn to, she felt helpless, alone, and lost. Just when Maria felt like she was losing herself completely, something unexpected happened. She found an ally. It was Mrs. Casson, her English teacher, who first noticed the change in Maria's behavior. The once bright and energetic girl had become withdrawn and distracted, often showing up to class with bruises on her arms and an uneasy look in her eyes. Mrs. Casson, a perceptive and compassionate woman, had seen the signs before. She had worked with other students who had suffered from abuse, and though Maria never directly opened up to her, Mrs. Casson knew something wasn't right. One afternoon, after class, Mrs. Casson gently asked Maria to stay behind. She seemed concerned, but not forceful. She didn't ask about the bruises directly, but instead spoke about school and Maria's well-being, giving her an opportunity to speak freely. Maria felt the weight of her isolation beginning to lift, just a little. Mrs. Casson didn't push, but simply made it clear that she was there for Maria, no matter what. It was the first time Maria had felt seen in weeks. Over the next few days, Mrs. Casson continued to check in on Maria, offering kind words and small acts of support. She'd sometimes slip a note into Maria's bag, telling her she was doing great, or suggesting that Maria take some time for herself. These small gestures made a world of difference to Maria, who had begun to doubt that anyone could care about her well-being. With Mrs. Casson's support, Maria began to feel a spark of hope. She wasn't entirely sure how, but for the first time in months, she started to consider the possibility of escaping. Maria knew she couldn't do it alone, but with Mrs. Casson's help, maybe, just maybe, she had a chance. Slowly, she began to open up, sharing bits of her story when the time felt right. It was small, tentative steps, but each one gave her the strength to think beyond her current situation. But Victor wasn't blind to Maria's growing connection with Mrs. Casson. He had been watching her more closely, sensing a shift in her behavior. He became suspicious, and one evening, when Maria was at her desk, Victor snooped through her belongings. He discovered a notebook in which Maria had begun jotting down her thoughts, including vague notes about her plans to seek help. It wasn't concrete evidence, but it was enough for Victor to realize that Maria was no longer as compliant as she had been. Victor was furious. That night, after Maria had gone to bed, he confronted her. His anger was explosive, his eyes wild with rage. He accused her of betraying him, of trying to destroy the family. Maria felt a wave of terror wash over her as she realized the full extent of Victor's twisted control. He demanded to know who she had been talking to, what she had been planning, and how much she had shared. His voice was cold and threatening, and for the first time, Maria truly feared for her safety. Victor's wrath was all-encompassing. He grabbed Maria by the arm and yanked her out of her room, dragging her down the hall to the living room. His voice was sharp and accusing, like a drill sergeant in the midst of an interrogation. "Do you think you can just leave? Do you think anyone will believe you?" he spat. "You're mine. You belong to this family, and if you don't start acting like it, I'll make sure you regret it." Maria, terrified and overwhelmed, stood frozen in place. She had no idea what he would do next, but she knew that this was the moment when everything could either break or bend. It was the first time she didn't want to cower, to apologize, to back down. She stood her ground, trembling but determined. She didn't know how, but she could feel in her heart that this was the turning point. She wasn't going to let him control her anymore. In that moment, as Victor's grip tightened and his threats escalated, Maria did something she never thought she could do. She looked him in the eye and told him, quietly but firmly, that she wasn't afraid of him anymore. Her words, though soft, were a spark of rebellion. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in months, Maria felt the courage to fight back, not with violence, but with her defiance. She knew that her fight wasn't over, and that it was going to get worse before it got better. But in the face of Victor's rage, she found something she hadn't realized she still had, her voice. As Maria expected, when Victor confronted her the next day, he played the victim. He told her mother that Maria had been acting out, that she was ungrateful, and that she was trying to destroy their family. Her mother, still heavily under Victor's influence, sided with him once again. She told Maria that she was being dramatic and that she needed to respect Victor's authority. Maria's heart shattered as she realized that her mother had become just another part of Victor's manipulation. The woman who had once been her protector was now an unwitting accomplice in her torment. Her mother didn't even try to understand. Instead, she accused Maria of betraying the family and making things difficult for everyone. Maria wanted to scream, to beg her mother to see the truth, but she knew it would do no good. The mother she had once known was gone, and in her place was someone who was more loyal to Victor than to her own daughter. With no one left to turn to, Maria felt the walls closing in again. But even in her darkest moment, she knew that there was no turning back. The battle for her freedom had begun, and she would fight alone if necessary, but she would fight. The confrontation with Victor that night had shaken Maria to her core, but it had also awakened something inside her, a deep, unrelenting determination. She knew that she couldn't stay under Victor's control any longer. With Mrs. Carson's support, Maria had been documenting everything she could, collecting small pieces of evidence that hinted at the abuse she was enduring. Her notebooks, her conversations with Mrs. Carson, and even some photographs she had taken secretly, all of them painted a damning picture. She had proof, and it was time to use it. The next evening, when Victor was at work, Maria made her move. She had been planning this moment for days, even though fear gnawed at her insides. She packed a small bag, gathering the evidence she had carefully stored away. She didn't know where she would go or what would happen next, but she knew she couldn't stay in that house a moment longer. Maria's only thought was to get out, to escape the suffocating control Victor had over her. She left a note for her mother, trying to explain, but Maria knew that it wouldn't change anything. Her mother had already made her choice, and Maria couldn't stay waiting for her to come around. With one last look at the home that had once held some semblance of comfort, Maria slipped out into the night. The next stop was Mrs. Carson's house. Maria arrived, her heart racing, her hands trembling, but her resolve was firm. Mrs. Carson took her in immediately, offering her a warm embrace and words of reassurance. They called the authorities together, and Maria handed over the evidence she had carefully gathered. The weight of what was about to happen hung heavily in the air, but Maria felt a small sense of relief. For the first time, she was doing something about it. She was no longer a victim, she was taking control of her own fate. It wasn't long before the authorities arrived at the house. Maria's escape had set a chain of events in motion that no one could undo. By the time Victor returned home, the police were already there, waiting for him. Maria's evidence was undeniable. He was arrested that evening, his twisted hold over her life finally shattered. Victor, ever the manipulator, tried to deny everything. He claimed that Maria had fabricated the entire story, that she was simply being rebellious, and that she had misunderstood his actions. But the evidence didn't lie. The photographs, the notebooks, and the testimonies, Maria's words were enough to expose him for the monster he truly was. As the police took him away, Maria watched from a distance, her heart pounding. She felt a strange sense of triumph, but it was tinged with a deep sadness. This was the man who had promised to protect her, and he had betrayed her in the worst way imaginable. But in that moment, Maria realized that she had taken back her power. She had exposed him for who he was, and nothing would ever be the same again. Victor's downfall was swift, but it was only the beginning of a new chapter for Maria. The abuse had been exposed, and she was free. As Victor's trial began, Maria found herself thrust into the spotlight. It was painful, reliving the details of the abuse in front of a courtroom full of strangers. But through it all, she had support. Mrs. Carson, along with a social worker who had been assigned to Maria's case, stood by her side. They helped her navigate the complexities of the legal system, offering her strength when she felt weak. The community, though initially shocked by the revelations, began to rally around Maria. There were whispers of disbelief at what Victor had done, but there were also expressions of admiration for Maria's courage. Her story became a beacon for others who had suffered in silence, and in the courtroom, her testimony was the key to securing a conviction. Maria's bravery had not only brought Victor to justice, but it had also sparked a broader conversation about abuse and manipulation. In the end, Victor was convicted and sentenced to prison, his reign of terror over Maria and her family ending once and for all. The authorities had done their part, but it was Maria's unwavering courage that had made it possible. The months following Victor's conviction were not easy for Maria. The weight of the trauma she had endured hung over her, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was in control of her life. She began therapy, working with a counselor who specialized in helping survivors of abuse. The healing process was slow, filled with days of doubt and nights of anxiety, but Maria was determined. Every step forward felt like a victory, no matter how small. Mrs. Carson remained by Maria's side, offering support and encouragement, and with her help, Maria reconnected with friends she had once lost touch with. Slowly, Maria learned how to trust again, not just others, but also herself. She realized that she was not the person Victor had tried to make her believe she was: weak, helpless, and unworthy. She was strong, capable, and deserving of love and respect. As time passed, Maria found a new sense of family in the people who supported her: Mrs. Carson, the social worker, and a few close friends. These relationships helped heal the wounds left by years of manipulation and abuse. Maria was no longer alone. She had created a new definition of family, one based on love, trust, and mutual respect. Maria's mother faced her own consequences, though they were of a different nature. Publicly, she was shunned for her complicity in allowing Victor's abuse to continue for as long as it had. Many people in the community found it hard to forgive her for turning a blind eye to her daughter's suffering. Some friends distanced themselves from her, and even her own family struggled to understand how she could have chosen Victor over her daughter. But Maria knew the truth. Her mother was not evil, but she was deeply manipulated, vulnerable, and fearful. Whether she ever sought redemption was uncertain, but Maria knew that she had made her peace with the situation. Her healing wasn't contingent on her mother's acceptance or apology. It was about reclaiming her own life. Maria's journey wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving. It was a testament to the strength and resilience of a young woman who, despite everything, never gave up on herself. Her courage to speak out, to fight back, and to seek help saved her life. Maria's story is one of hope for others who might be trapped in situations of abuse. It is a reminder that no matter how dark the road may seem, there is always a way out, and the strength to overcome is within us all. Maria's story is a difficult but powerful reminder of the importance of speaking up and seeking help when facing abuse. As you reflect on her journey, ask yourself, what would you do if you knew someone in Maria's position? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe our African Folktales channel.